We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power, the Anadromist from Tbilisi, Georgia, formerly of Alaska, formerly of New York City, formerly of California, but now living in the Caucasus Mountains in the capital of the Georgia. Well, today what we're going to do is I'm going to play you something that I made a while ago. This was on the Anadromist channel, my main channel for ideas, but this belongs over here on the Anadrome as part of my series on movies, music, media. And what we're doing, well, I'll explain in a moment what we're doing, but the reason I'm putting it over here is because it deserves to have a series of its own over here of the symbolism of horror. So I hope you appreciate it. Let's go to the past and listen to me talk. What we're going to do today is we are going to discuss the basic symbolism of horror. And by basic symbolism, I do not mean we're not even going to discuss werewolves and vampires. We're going to discuss things that are more primary than that. And so we're going to begin our investigation during the Romantic era. The Romantic era roughly takes place between the year 1800 and 1890. Give or take, and there's certainly other things going on at the same time. This is the period in which the philosophy of Romanticism became very strong in the general culture of Europe, and to a lesser degree, America. There's a bit of a prehistory in Germany, also with the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and realism was kind of a counterpoint to Romanticism, but we're not going to do an in-depth dive on Romanticism, or in a moment we'll talk about symbolism or the symbolists. What we're trying to do is establish the roots of horror and horror imagery. So one of the important things about the emphasis on culture and ideas and philosophy during the Romantic era was that it was essentially a questioning of the scientific rationalism, a questioning of the Industrial Revolution. It put nature ahead of, say, technology, or in the form of the new industry. It romanticized, we now say, things like farm life, the idyllic. It discovered things like mountains. There was also an emphasis upon the aesthetic experience, the ability. This is how they discovered mountains in the late 1700s. They went up to the mountains of Switzerland and began to say, "Oh my goodness, these mountains!" And they had a specific word, sublime. They make us feel awed and humble by them. There was also an emphasis on emotion and the soul. Jean-Jacques Rousseau really emphasized l'âme, the soul, and so what was seen as more important was not these new rational ideas, but rather the free individual. And so there's a real emphasis upon the freedom of the individual here. Robespierre in the French Revolution saw him conducting his reign of terror in the name of the freedom of the individual, which is a very interesting contradiction. There was also an emphasis on folk art. Many of the Romantic composers made works based upon folk music, which was a kind of a new idea. Bach did not do it in such a way. Beethoven kind of hints at it. He's really the bridge between the classical composer and the Romantic composer. But eventually you get people like Liszt, Hungarian Rhapsodies, everyone seemed to be going back to their culture. Grieg's music goes back to Norwegian culture and borrows from that. So this also led to nationalism and the rise of nationalism. Prior to that, you had people living in kingdoms or duchies, or there were a few nascent republics. But the idea of the nation, it's during this period that Germany comes together from being a lot of feudal principalities into the nation of Germany. And the same with Italy, by the way. And it's during this period that we start to get what's called Gothic literature. And Gothic literature is essentially the early horror literature, but it also divides off and goes into Romantic literature, romance literature, meaning, about people falling in love. And you can see this with the Bronte sisters. And eventually, through Edgar Allan Poe, it divides off again into detective and mystery fiction. So Gothic literature is quite an unusual fountainhead of ideas. Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, lots of clanking chains. There was a real interest in the Middle Ages. One of the aspects of all parts of modernism in my book is that they go back to an earlier age, borrow from it, and retool it for the new age. So where the rationalists and the Renaissance went back to classical antiquity, the Romantics are going back to the Middle Ages, and they're very into medievalism. In fact, the word Gothic comes because they named these cathedrals Gothic cathedrals. They weren't really made by the Goths, except as the people who settled in France and Germany and such. The rulers were from old Gothic families who had taken over from the dregs of the Roman Empire. So, but Gothicism became a thing. So the interest in castles and ruins, in old cathedrals and such. This is very much an aspect of this Romantic period. And then the art began to exhibit this as well. So, for instance, Goya is a Romantic era artist, and one of the first who really starts to emphasize horror in his painting. So, for instance, in what's called his capriccios, caprices, although they're anything but capricious, they're very dark and filled with witchcraft and demons. His most famous one from that series of sketches is called The Sleep of Reason Leads to Monsters, which I think is really telling. And but again, you had novels like M.G. Lewis's The Monk, filled with dark, decadent kind of imagery. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but Gustave Doré illustrated it later in the 19th century, and it's filled with, like, I love the skeletons, the death essentially playing dice with like an angel on this forbidden boat. Gustave Moreau is an artist who is very much a pre-symbolist. So is Gustave Doré. But Gustave Moreau, you can see a painting here, the kind of an image of Salome with the head of John the Baptist. This is in the middle of the 19th century. And so there's an emphasis upon the supernatural. Jacques Barzun, the cultural critic, discusses in a great essay at the beginning of the Penguin Encyclopedia of Horror and the Supernatural, an essay called The Art and Appeal of the Ghostly and the Supernatural. He discusses how essentially this Gothic literature and this emphasis, this romantic emphasis on horror, leads essentially it's coming out of a time when religion is beginning to be questioned, if not by the masses, certainly by the elites and the artists. And what they're putting in its place is humanity. But what they're really putting in its place are these emotions, these dark emotions as well. They go back, it's interesting, just at a time when people were beginning to stop believing in angels and demons and to believe in religious rites, they begin to then conjure up all of these demonic forces in their literature. It's as though they are haunted by the ghost of religion. And the question is whether they were haunted by it because they essentially had killed it and yet they couldn't escape it, or whether they're haunted by it because essentially humanity cannot get away from the religious impulse inside of us. And I'll leave you to think about that. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, we come across symbolism. I've already mentioned Gustave Moreau. Gustave Moreau is kind of a proto-symbolist. The symbolist creates images that are very different. It's kind of the romanticism taking another turn. You can follow these different strains of thought. Realism is the other, in art and fiction and literature, is the other side of rationalism. It's looking at the everyday life, whereas symbolism and the symbolist art and literature of the end of the 19th century is a very different order of things. It kind of begins with Edgar Allan Poe. And all the symbolists, in one way or another, are influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, because Poe takes this kind of romantic mood, but then pushes it to this extreme of dreams and decadence and horror, things that people had really never seen before. Near the end of the 19th century, you get this decadent movement. It's sometimes called, in some places it's decadent, and that's really a decadent lifestyle. It emphasizes things, well, it's a dark romanticism. It's the first movement that begins to have a great deal of homosexuality attached to it, although at that time they would not have used the word gay. I don't know if they would even use the word homosexual. They might have used the word invert at the time. But the point was that it was an inversion of everything that had been seen as normal. And there was a great deal of occultism during this period as well. The Rosicrucian movement was strong in the symbolist era. So what was important also was the aesthetics of things and the dream. This was definitely not an egalitarian movement. You had to have money to have beautiful things. So it was... and even if you didn't have money, you had to feign that you had money, or at least prestige, or at least cultural clout, which is why Oscar Wilde is such a big figure during this time. Another important figure of the symbolist era, kind of early on, is Wagner, and he was also very influential. Wagner's mythology is very important. J.K. Huysmans wrote the book Against the Grain, Horrors, and that was a very important book. He describes the lifestyle of these decadent symbolists, of which he was himself one, but he turns to Catholicism. He wrote a book on Satanism, but eventually turns to Catholicism. And in fact, several of these symbolists did turn to Catholicism, not Protestantism. And that's very interesting, because Catholicism has much more of this symbolic imagery, whereas Protestant is like a cleaned up house that just has white walls. The Catholic Church, particularly then as opposed to now, had a lot more ornate imagery going on in the church. Drugs were important. The emphasis on dreams is really important, and on mythology. Another one of my favorite writers, George MacDonald, definitely has a symbolist bent to his works. particularly Lilith, and his children's stories like The Golden Key and The Light Princess are just filled with intricate symbolic meaning. And I highly recommend George MacDonald, a Scottish Christian writer, but it's like Edgar Allan Poe crossed with, well, he was very influential on Tolkien. The art we've been looking at, Caspar David Friedrich, the classic man standing in the clouds, and you can see off to the background ruined castle, and that's very important. We've talked about Goya, and we've talked about Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Gustave Doré and Gustave Moreau. This painting right now is by Adolf Herring, kind of a disturbing painting. It's called Der Tod und das Mädchen, Death and the Maiden, a very common symbol, kind of coming from the danse macabre, or the dance of death. And, a lot of skeletons show up in symbolist painting, for instance. And these images are going to form the bedrock for horror films in the 20th century. And so much horror imagery is going to be found in the symbolist art of the late 19th century. Important figure during this time is Sarah Bernhardt, who was an actress, a symbolist actress. And symbolist plays spoken a very strange, slow, emotive language. This is a poster by Alphonse Mucha, the Czech painter and poster designer, who was also instrumental in creating the motifs of Art Nouveau, and this is for his poster of Medea. And you can see it moves from beauty all the way down to death and horror imagery. Connected with symbolism and Art Nouveau is Expressionism. And Expressionism is important because you now take some of those symbolist ideas, but now your way of portraying them, it's very loose. It's almost like it mixes with Impressionism. Impressionism was a much more realism-based art, and that is to say, most of Impressionism is pictures of flowers and cathedrals and daily life, and the Impressionists weren't concerned with any sort of mythological substructure to their work. They took their art and painted outdoors, which was like a revelation to people. But in Expressionism, for instance, it moves from things like Edvard Munch's The Scream, which you see here, to something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is German Expressionism. But here on this poster, you really see the connection between Dr. Caligari and the Edvard Munch. That is to say, a similar looseness of style, an expressive style. Also in the poster here for Walter Wegener's Der Golem from about 1920, you see this strange, again, and the movie is like this as well, strange bent buildings. The point is not to be realistic, essentially taking Van Gogh, but, or should I say, Van Gogh, and turning him into something darker and mysterious. Van Gogh he's much more like an impressionist. He does realistic scenes, but in a very strange expressionistic style. He's a post-impressionist, but he's also a pre-expressionist. And here's a poster for F.W. Murnau's great vampire story, basically Dracula, called Nosferatu. And again, you see, this is really the expressionist style, and the movie, as we will see, is also in the style as well. There's another film, Warning Shadows, or Schatten, which is using shadows and dark images in an expressionistic vein. So expressionism goes really deeply into horror, the horror genre, particularly, you can see this if you see something like Weird Tales covers from the 1930s and 40s, but you can really see it if you look at the horror films of the from the teens all the way through the 30s. Really, you have a lot of expressionist, German expressionist style. This one too, as well. It's a Todd Browning film, but it is essentially has many of the shadows and darkness because there's so many Germans who fled during World War I, came to America, or they came in the 1920s to try to make a career in America. Danish filmmaker Carl Dreyer, absolutely incredible film. One of my absolute favorites called Vampire. And this too, very much an expressionist idea. And we'll get a look at this film a little bit later. And what's fascinating to me is the idea that, well, for one thing, what's interesting is that you'll notice this kind of horror script. You know, what we tend to think of now is like horror writing. So, you know, it's just kind of like scratchy letters or blood-dripping letters and stuff. This is all coming straight from Expressionism. And particularly Expressionist posters, and particularly Expressionist movie posters, as you can see. So what I want to do is look at the basic symbolism of horror. I read this book back in the 1980s. Dreadful Pleasures, Anatomy of Modern Horror by James B. Twitchell. And what he did was try to essentially look at what he considered to be the basic imagery of horror films. And my issue with this was that essentially he was taking a Freudian interpretation. So, for one thing, and I'm not sure he's wrong here, he thought horror films were largely geared towards teenagers. Although, given the fact that people have extended their teen years into their mid-30s these days, obviously horror films still attract lots and lots of people. But he said basically it was like a rite of passage. He also saw characters like Dracula. You know, obviously there's strong sexual imagery in Dracula. Frankenstein, he saw as the result of that sexual union, the baby gone wrong. The werewolf, he sees, you know, the man usually becoming the sexual predator, fighting his dual nature, similar with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And he was going through the kind of liturgy of horror monsters. And I had a big problem. I said, everything doesn't boil down to sex in horror. There is another huge element. For instance, what do zombies have to do with a sexual interpretation of horror? Nothing. They're shambling. They can be male or female. It's all about the body mindlessly moving on. It has no sexual components. I mean, there have been one or two depictions of zombie romances, but we all know that's kind of silly, you know. So it's really been more about death and the mindlessness coming back for us, or the skeleton. Most people can't tell a male and female skeleton apart just by looking at it quickly. The skeleton is a very neutral image, and it's an image of death, which we'll discuss. But as I started thinking about it back in the 80s, I would say that these ideas here are what I've arrived at as, unlike Mr. Twitchell's ideas of what he considered basic horror imagery, which has to do with monsters exclusively, and this Freudian interpretation of them as sexual beings, which, like I said, there's obviously something to it, but you can also stretch this to the breaking point as well. My feeling is these are what's underneath everything. And the very first thing is, the very first basic horror image is the dark.
Look, put 5 men dressed like cats on the screen. What do they look like?
Like 5 men dressed like cats.
When an audience pays to see a picture like this, what do they pay for?
To get the pants scared off them.
And what scares the human race more than any other single thing?
The dark.
Of course. And why? Because the dark has a life of its own. In the dark, all sorts of things come alive.
Suppose we never do show the catmen. Is that what you're thinking?
Exactly.
No catmen.
All right. Now, what we put on the screen, it'll make the backs of their necks crawl.
Two eyes, shining in the dark. A dog, frightened, growling, showing its fang. A bird, its neck broken, feathers torn from its throat. A little girl screaming, claw marks down her cheeks.
That's from a film called The Bad and the Beautiful, directed by Vincent Minnelli. And what's interesting about film and darkness is they actually don't like each other, because one of the most difficult things to get in a film is absolute darkness. And in fact, one of the things that, whenever you see nighttime in a film, it's always a stylized nighttime, because I've been in dark woods where you can't see a thing. And that is truly, truly, truly scary. But darkness is universal. And it's a difficult thing to deal with in films. It also represents the unknown. And it represents sleep. But if you can deal with the dark in a certain way in a film, it is so effective.
You were saying the cats.
They torment me. I wake in the night, and the tread of their feet whispers in my brain. I have no peace, for they are in me.
In me? In me?
And of course, the modern scientist brings the light of day in. Meanwhile, the dark suggests the dream. And dreams are also very important, but they aren't a specific image. What is related then to darkness is the shadow. Now, I'm not talking about the shadow in the Jungian sense of the word. I am talking about it in our actual experience of shadows, of the dark reflection of ourselves on a wall or on a street or in a corner. These are images from the movie Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau. And Murnau understood, and I think the expressionists in general understood much more than we do today, the power of shadows. I find the early period of horror films the most fascinating for many of these basic elements. And sometimes we get so convoluted, having seen way too many horror films, that we no longer know how to create horror out of these most basic elements. And yet I feel if you know how to do this, you know how to make a great horror film. This is from a film called Warning Shadows, or Chateau. And this is a film not many people have seen. Unfortunately, you can't really see the clarity of the film that well here. Someone's put some sort of smudgy, they wanted it to look old, whereas an actual print of the film on a DVD or Blu-ray is going to look better than this. But you have a character who is a shadow puppeteer. He's shown shadow puppets to these people. Look at what he's doing with the shadows here. He's changing people's shadows, and then he moves them in the shadow world to the other side of the table. And now everything that happens in the film after this happens in this shadowy other world. And what he's done is he's seen the hearts and desires of these characters, and how the husband is filled with rage and jealousy. The wife has taken a lover. The husband's friends are just greedy sycophants who will do whatever he says. And eventually he is going to have his friends in this dream world kill his wife. And you'll see this scene in just a second. And it's a very haunting scene. But all the worst things in this dream world happen in shadows. Shadows continue to be used. For instance, in modern films, occasionally, Freddy Krueger's shadow, Dracula's shadow in Bram Stoker's Dracula, Coppola's film. And this is, of course, another scene from Nosferatu, as is this. Now, this shows us something different. Besides the shadow, another thing that some of these older films focused on was sleepwalking, or somnambulism, which I find to be tremendously creepy. And this, of course, is from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920. And Cesare, the somnambulist who's kept locked in his kind of hypnotic sleeping state, is sent on a mission by the evil Dr. Caligari to go take this woman, or at least kill her. But look at the tension that's created just by this strange, slumbering, walking figure who is not fully awake.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Closely related to the sleepwalker is the zombie, and George Romero finds this very interesting connection in his original Night of the Living Dead in 1968. But also notice where this is located. It's in a cemetery. The things of death, skeletons, skulls, graveyards,
Come with me.
are all things which really cause us a great deal of stress in movies when done correctly. Interestingly enough, this was actually almost a jokey movie where Vincent Price is playing the woman's husband. And in fact, it's realized this isn't even a real skeleton. It's a skeleton being manipulated by like a fishing line. Nevertheless, I remember as a kid being tremendously freaked out by this scene. Skeleton imagery is universally a sign of death. Why? Because that's what we all become. We become these skeletons. You strip the flesh off of us, and this is what's left. This is a very interesting image. It's from the early 20th century. I think about 1906. It's by Segundo de Chomón, a Spanish filmmaker, and this is called Satan s'amuse, Satan at play. Satan's playing with himself here. But it's a Satan as a skeleton, which is very interesting. Now, this next film clip, I'm going to let us just watch for a minute. But it's from the movie Vampire by Carl Theodor Dreyer. And it was made during the beginning of the talkie era, but it's basically a silent film. But look at the images that we're seeing. Look at this figure across the river reflection. It's someone limping along. There's this man who stands in for us looking. He sees these strange images. The man digging with the shovel going backwards. He enters the door. 2 doors, actually. The one he just passed through the gate, and then this one. Doors are very important. And now we start to see shadows. And this is a shadow of the strange reflection he saw outdoors. But it's a man with one leg. And given us this was made after World War I, probably really was a man with one leg. And there's this aura of strangeness and eeriness about this whole scene. It doesn't drive the plot forward. We enter instead into almost a dream world. Strange old woman comes out. She ends up being the vampire. I'm giving it away, but not really. This is at the very beginning of the film. It's like he's in a maze. And then the man's shadow finds him again. And then strange images of just holes in walls. The shadow of a pendulum. The shadow of dancers. Just shadows. There's something about the shadow figure that does something to us, which is why shadow puppetry, of course, is so great. And why does he keep showing this man digging backwards? I don't know. Again, it's very much a dream. And the dream is another one of those things that's very important in horror films, the dream-like quality. Because in so many horror films, we know this can't happen, and yet these things still affect us. So he goes up into this attic-like place. And we're going to discuss this in the future, but attics and basements are very important in horror. There's a coffin. Is it ready for him? I'll give you a hint. Yeah. Look at that skeleton. And what's the art on the back of the walls? Old books, a skull. We heard a dog barking earlier. There's a monkey's skull. And that animal image is very important to where we're going from here. And what is that, a baby? And I am sure that wasn't a plastic replica. And what is that? Is that a mannequin head or a statue? Just strange images that provoke the thoughts. Skulls on top. Now, I've been in Europe, and I've been in a crypt in Sicily. I went down there with just random skulls hanging around on it. And, you were just allowed to walk in there. It was just, I got a few photos of them. Quite something to think about. The texture in this whole scene is fantastic, the way it moves back and forth. And if you've followed any of my other videos and lectures, you know that texture really fascinates me. And as this scene is about to end, we just see, he looks up, and you just see the hand moving across. Now, we will see who that is, but we're not going to watch the whole movie. Let's talk about those animals, shall we? Because animals is another very primary source of fear. That's why there are so many big animal movies. And this scene... from the movie The Revenant is, having lived in Alaska, I can tell you, when I saw this in a movie theater, I was glued to the back of my chair because I said, yeah, this is a bear attack. And I kept telling Leo, don't move. Like at a certain point halfway through this, we stop at about the halfway point. The bear wanders off. And yeah, but it's not just the wild animal. Sometimes it's man's best friend. There are so many horrifying dogs in movies and other animals as well. Earlier, we did see a scene from Cat People. That was from Cujo, of course. And the animal
Black Phillip Sif, you are wicked.
Does he really speak to thee?
The farm animal, in this case Black Phillip from The Witch, easily one of the eeriest animal nightmares in recent times. And then there's the inexplicable use of animals in Hitchcock's The Birds. We are never given a reason why the birds are attacking people, what they want. We're just shown them. And yet that's how we see animals. They're just there. And through humanity, animals have been a source of strange frustrations for us. And what is our relationship to them? And horror films often prod at this question in a way like some direct statement by PETA could never tell you. In fact, the horror film understands the animal. PETA thinks the animal is some sort of romantic creature, but these are not. And this is from the 1931 Todd Browning version of Dracula near the opening. Several things come to mind. First, the death imagery, the coffin. Then, what's really important about this place is there's an animal. Interestingly enough, rather than being a rat, that's a possum, which is kind of a freaky looking rat. And then an insect. So, two strange animals. And then a woman. We will discuss women in films at another point. But it's the architecture that's so important at the beginning of Dracula. It is the crypt, it's the stairs, it's the cobwebs on the architecture. So architecture plays a very, very important mood-enhancing ingredient in horror films. But this, of course, is coming out of the Gothic era. Now, Dracula, as written by Bram Stoker, is actually more of a symbolist creation and has that decadence attached to it from the symbolist era, which is why I think it is such a Dracula is such a sexual being, because it was during the symbolist era that there was this emphasis upon not just the emotion but sensuality. And here is the repository of an armadillo or two. Or three. I saw a third one back there. But it's the old Europe which is fading, that world of dukes and barons and old families.
I am Dracula.
Now, this is from a strange film. It's called The Maze by William Cameron Menzies. I think it's from about 1953. And what's interesting here is that, well, there's a shadow going under the door. Notice the lighting, very much film noir lighting. But of course, film noir lighting comes from German Expressionism just as much as it does in horror films. Now, this isn't the greatest film in the world. The actual conclusion is a little, I won't say silly, but they didn't have the special effects to really pull it off. But what's really interesting to me about this film is the architecture. Now, she goes around looking, and there's some other elements we're going to start to see. Of course, the light. At some point, I'll talk about the light in the darkness, but not in this one. There's a whole use of candles and lights, although that candle is not really lighting the room, as you can see. But here, there's a tapestry or a curtain on the wall, and she goes to look behind it. Now, just pay attention to that fabric for a minute. Also notice what she's put on in terms of her nightgown. She goes into the dark place, and now she enters the cobwebbed room. Of course, spiders are a great source of fear for so many people. Spiders are probably way up there in terms of creatures that give human beings phobias. In Alaska, I knew all these kids who would be around bears. but show them a spider? Yeah. A little bit of a flimsy bat there, but, they just didn't have the special effects to pull it off. Go with it as someone from the 1950s, and it looks really different. But here's the important thing. It's going up to the attic. And the attic takes you to hidden secrets. It's almost always true in horror films. Now, I love the lighting here. Look at the shadow on her nightgown. I guess that's a night robe. She goes up this old, decaying stairway. And the fact that it's a white, longer robe is very important, as we shall see momentarily. She comes up to a window, and she looks out. Well, what does she see? A maze. A maze is architecture made out of vegetation. But a maze, and there's a light in there. And it obviously symbolizes being trapped, but it's also a secret. What's at the heart of the maze, which becomes, of course, part of the whole point of this movie. And of course, the maze harkens back to Stanley Kubrick's maze in The Shining. And this is a great shot where he has these people walking from a long distant view. Also labyrinthingly is in the 1925 Phantom of the Opera. The Phantom, with a mask on, takes Christine, the singer, through a series of labyrinthine passageways to the bottom of the opera house in Paris. Now, notice what she has. She didn't need to have this, but the filmmakers decided it was very important that she did. And it's this long, strange, flowing, cape or something. Now, there's the animal. And animals often have a very dreamlike representation in horror films, particularly these early horror films. But I think they still do, even in something like, the alligator film recently. It slipped my mind. It'll probably come back when I don't need to think about it. But check out this. I love this downhill progression on this stage. Now, this is all there for the opera to move things around. But he finally then comes to a subterranean lake and gets in a boat that's waiting there. Now, I can tell you this is romanticized. I have been in the Paris sewers. Wow, do they smell. But that's not the point. The point is not to think about that. The point is to think about this underground world, this underworld in which there lives. This underworld in which there lives a phantom. What is a phantom? Spirit, human, monster. And there is a light at the front of the boat that he hangs. Although, again, it's not a light that produces much actual light in terms of cinematography. But nevertheless, there's the symbolism of the light in the darkness, which, again, is something you often see in horror films and has a very specific kind of resonance. In this case, it's guiding. And again, this strange use of fabric and material. And finally, he arrives at the place he actually lives. But look at the architecture here. And the architecture is resonant and dreamlike. And how did the door open? Again, it's a dream. We're not here to ask questions about who's down there opening the door. People who ask those kind of questions, like who opened the door, are what Alfred Hitchcock called the plausibles. They always want a plausible reason for why everything happens in a film. This is very obviously dream imagery. It doesn't require explanation. It requires that you look and that you enter the dream and use it to reflect on life. Now, this is another film that very, very few people have ever seen. It's called The Fall of the House of Usher, or in French, the real name is La Chute de la Maison Usher. It's from the Edgar Allan Poe story. Notice this fabric. And the fabric becomes the most important element here. Now, if you know the story, is Jean Epstein made this film. Now, if you know the story, you'll know that near the end of it, the sister who is dead, or we thought was dead, comes back from the grave to haunt the brother, or to take the brother down to hell. But, so there's the wind. And then there are these curtains. And in this whole scene, in fact, in many points in this film, it is the fabric doing the work. So after architecture, we come to this strange thing of fabric, of curtains, of veils, of tapestries, of different things moving. And this all has a deep meaning. Like, so, for instance, it's suggested in the Edgar Allan Poe story that the house splits in half. But what he's doing in this film is suggesting it with things moving around. Obviously, he's got some kind of fan or something moving things around. But it's that sense of movement through the wind. But the wind, like in the old Greek and Hebrew, wind also meant spirit. And it also meant breath. And you still see that sense in the images where you have the costume or the fabric moving. Now, if you look way in the back of this scene, you'll see the woman coming in. She was buried in this ceremonial veil, but it could also be seen as a wedding veil. So the veil, the dress, very much has the implications of the funeral and the wedding in so many scenes. Think of the scene of the burial gown in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Francis Ford Coppola movie. And it's just elaborate, and but nevertheless very necessary. I find fabric is very important in Bram Stoker's Dracula film as well. But here you have, you do see her face, but you almost don't need to, because the fabric itself is suggesting something ghostly. And is she beautiful or is she ugly? You don't know. There's a scene in George MacDonald's Lilith book where the narrator is following Lilith, and she's wearing a hood and cloak, and he can't get in front of her to see whether she's beautiful or ugly, and she's walking him along through the forest at night. And it's that tension between beauty and ugly. What is it that I find very fascinating? And that, I believe, is completely a symbolist image. This is from 1928, but it's definitely symbolism of the late 19th century, and with a bit of a slide into the 20th century. But what's interesting is that a lot of symbolist ideas went straight into horror films. And we'll see this as we continue. And so this is suggesting several things at once. One, that the house is falling apart. Two, that his sister, his twin sister, for whom Poe suggests very strange ancestral relationship, not quite consummated, but something very odd. Poe was great at doing just extremely odd things, which is why his work is so important to the symbolist. And I'm noticing that tree there, I realized we could have spent a while talking about, and I should have spent more time perhaps talking about trees and forests and other natural things that create horrific sensations within us. But Jean Epstein is a filmmaker who really demands more attention from people. There is a box set in France of his work that is certainly worth a look. He did a lot of work in the silent era and in the early talking period. So one thing that was interesting is that in the early 20th century in Italy, in the teens of the 20th century, there was a strange grouping of films and actresses. This is Rhapsodia Satanica, which featured these strange diva-like women. And this film is essentially a variation on Faust. That is Satan waiting for this woman who has sold her soul to the devil. She was an old woman in order to become young. And this is at the end of the film where she knows essentially her time is up. She's been given more years of life. Now here's another image that I'm not going to spend too long talking about, but it's very important. The use of mirrors in horror fiction of all sorts. And how many mirrors are we looking at here? It is more than you think. There's one that we're looking through up front as well. And so what she's doing is she's getting ready for her, in a sense, marriage to Satan, but also the stripping of her illusions. She will find herself an old hag at the end. I'm not going to show you all of that, because you should look for this film. So, you can find it, I believe, on YouTube. And give it a look. It's just fascinating for imagery. This is the kind of film I think would be really, an update of this would be really a great idea. Because people are so beauty obsessed now. A woman who sells her soul to the devil to become young again. But this, check this out. But look how many mirrors you are actually looking at here. There was about 4 or 5 right there. And then she puts on the wedding veil. But then again, is this wedding or funeral? And she's walking around a bit like a somnambulist, going towards the devil who is calling her. This is Lyda Borelli, who starred in many of these strange diva films from the teens of the 20th century in Italy. That's a great shot. Just look at the light on that and the shadow. It's silhouette shadow. The devil is a shadow. Just genius. They had a word for her. It was Borellissima. To be like Borellissima is extravagant emotions. This is just purely symbolism in the art romantic sense of the word. Check this out. This is about 5 years before Dr. Caligari. And that weird color flickering effect is because all of the frames on this film were hand painted. And I love this strange hand painted effect. And now she wanders through the forest, the dark forest. And who's waiting for her? Well, we know who. And we'll cut before we show you her as an old woman. Let her dream. But then there's this figure. Again, mummy films are highly, highly symbolist works. And this is the scene at the beginning of the 1932 Mummy. Boris Karloff playing the mummy. And one thing about this film is that The Mummy introduces other elements. We have the fabric. We have something else going on with the face. And that is he's wearing something like a mask. But check out the reaction of the man studying the manuscripts to him seeing a living mummy. Insane laughter.
What's the matter, man?
You don't see insane laughter that much these days, although you do find it in the Joker movies, and particularly Joaquin Phoenix's Joker has brought the insane laugh back. And I think for these times, very important. So this brings us to the subject of the mask. Masks are very important. This is from Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
Please, come forward.
And Stanley Kubrick uses the Venetian carnival mask. He used them from many different creators of these masks. So there's a variety of different kinds of masks here. But these are all Venetian carnival masks, which have a very eerie quality. They were used to disguise people. For instance, the rich could walk around without people knowing who they were, or people could get up to nefarious things without knowing who they were. So the mask disguises the intention of the person. And then there's always the question, what's behind the mask? One of the most famous masks is the Michael Myers mask from Halloween, which ironically was just a kind of a blank, old, bad Captain Kirk mask from the 1960s, and they just found it. But watch this scene, and we're going to look at the scene a little bit more in depth, but just keep your eyes on it.
Well, kiddo, thought you outgrew superstition.
Jamie Lee Curtis in perhaps her most iconic role. So let's go back. She walks along and she stops. But now look at that. What was that? You see, one of the strange things about this film is what's just out of sight and you hardly see. So look again. See that figure? There were actually two of them. So it wasn't Michael Myers, but just the suggestion of someone there. And then children in Halloween costumes. Well, it's actually not even Halloween yet, but that doesn't matter. Now look again. Look at those curtains. I told you about the relationship of fabric and windy fabric in particular. There's Michael Myers in that dead mask, like a spirit. and that emphasis upon the blowing fabric, that is not just an accident. Symbolically, that is the key to the scene, really. So let's discuss the mask some more. This is one of the most famous masked scenes that there are in film history. Lon Chaney, great actor, played so many tortured and outcast roles. He's kidnapped Christine, the opera singer, the young opera singer. But she wants to know what's behind the mask. As do we, the audience. And so she has decided to do it and to take the mask. Now, by makeup standards of our day, that doesn't seem particularly horrifying to us, except when you realize Lon Chaney actually did this to his face. He was his own makeup man. Which brings us into entire questions of deformity and hideous imagery and the human face, which we will discuss in another video. But what's fascinating to me is the relationship between the mask and the face. And in this case, the mask hides the forbidden thing. The mask is the mask wasn't particularly hideous, although it was strange. But it hides his face, and his face is very skull-like. So his face reminds one of death, just in its visage. Chaney could always play the sorrow of a character as well. He was a very good actor for getting inside of the monster and showing you the heart of the beast, so to speak. Interestingly enough, when I was a young child, my mother wanted me to go see one of the first films I ever saw in a movie theater. And television wasn't very good then. So this is one of the first things I ever saw was The Phantom of the Opera. Now, my mother had, in 1943, seen this version with Claude Rains as the Phantom. And she had wanted me to see this. So she thought, and this film, the 1943 version with Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy, was played as a romance, with a romantic thriller. But instead, we ended up seeing the 1962 version, which starred Herbert Lom as the Phantom.
Young woman, you must come with me.
And look at this mask. It is frightening. Now, what's interesting is my mother freaked out. She was like, why, this is a Hammer Horror Films where she said, why did I take you to see this? And, but it put this thing in me. What's interesting about that mask is it's not to hide the face, although his face is scarred. He doesn't look nearly as bad as Lon Chaney, though. And he is, in fact, not the villain of the story as Lon Chaney is. But in fact, it's like the mask is the evil in this case. And here's another case. This is actually, check out the fabric in this one. This is from the ball scene, the grand ball, in the 1925 Phantom of the Opera. Again, hand paint. Well, this was actually a 2-strip Technicolor process. And it's just 1 or 2 scenes in the Phantom of the Opera that had this kind of primitive use of color, which I love. I love these primitive colors. So everyone's wearing these costume masks for this ball. And there's Christine, and she's waiting for a suitor. And then in the middle of it, something happens. The Phantom decides to visit the ball. Now the whole idea of a costume ball in itself is something that doesn't happen, certainly in this way these days, but it is a strangely chaotic call. Now, what's being referenced here, and this is not to my knowledge in the original novel, what's being referenced here is Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, mask being a ball, but it's also the mask. And Chaney comes out as the Phantom wearing a skeleton mask. And everyone stops, and he has a presence much like the Red Death in Edgar Allan Poe's story. He's wearing red. He represents death. And look at the clowns and all these masks. Someone dressed as a jester comes up to him, but he is death. This is one of my favorite parts of the 1925 Phantom of the Opera, because it's the kind of thing you just don't see this sort of attention to emotional detail anymore. Just Chaney, his parents were deaf mutes, and so most silent acting is pantomime, but Chaney's pantomime is like at the top of the pile, and his ability just to hold his hand in a certain way and to create motion out of his hand when he's masked is absolutely incredible. Now, this is one of my favorite movies of all time, Les Yeux Sans Visage, or The Eyes Without a Face. Georges Franchot, 1959, came out the year before Psycho. And check out this mask. It is a blank mask worn by a woman who was in a terrifyingly bad car crash. And the whole story is essentially questioning the nature of beauty and the nature of ugliness. But this mask is actually quite a beautiful mask, and yet, like the Michael Myers mask, it is blank. But blank in a very, it's a strange kind of blankness. Do you want to see what's behind the mask? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie. Which then brings us back to Halloween. And this is from the 2007 Halloween, which I think is a much better film than a lot of people give it credit for. I look at the whole film as being a treatise on the wearing of masks and the creation of masks. And so this rather normal, plump-looking kid turns into a killer when he wears the mask. And so we've seen all these different elements together, and we come to something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And we start off with a bit of that kind of photography that lets you know something's going to happen. It's the way it's standing back from the action makes you feel like you're being watched. But look at the house, a white, traditional house, much like the houses in the movie Halloween, which came out later. This is from 1974. Now, there was an earlier house we saw, an old, creepy house in this movie. And that's where you expect all hell to break loose. I mean, it's called the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So you expect bad things to happen.
Got something for you.
But, well, but then you go inside, and now all the elements are at play all at once.
Hello?
Darkness, old architecture,
Hello?
fabric. The texture in this film is absolutely incredible. And of course, one of the most infamous masks in the history of cinema.
Hello? Anybody home? Hello?
The sound of animals. Animal skulls.
Hey, Pam. Hello?
One of the most shocking scenes in cinema, especially if you have no warning that it's coming, as some audiences been. And yet, there's something about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that resonates so deeply on so many different levels. And I think the truth is that it hits on all those levels, and then there's the mask. But the mask covers up which will become the most important thing for us to understand, one of the deepest of all horrors. The human being, the human shape, the human figure, the human psyche. So there you are. The basic images of horror, the basic symbolism of horror. Darkness, death, shadows, sleepwalking, dreams, masks, animals. When we come back and do this again, we'll then tackle a much thornier problem, something even more frightening to us. The human figure, the human body, the human shape, and the human psyche. What it means to be human, the dark side. Anyway, thank you for coming and watching the Anadrome. This is Byrne. We will be meeting again very soon.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.